Welcome to Stories from the NNI. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Jim Schuck, Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Columbia University. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you first got involved in nanotechnology?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, first of all. Yeah, so I've always, for as long as I can remember, been interested in math and in science, but my training, formally is in physics. And I would say that my real interest in physics started when my grandfather, who himself was an aeronautical engineer and designed satellites, gave me a book about Richard Feynman. You might remember this book. It was called Genius. And I read that, and I immediately knew I had to be a physicist at that time. It really resonated. I knew that something about being able to gain new insights into the universe was just so striking and appealing, and to realize that just by studying, some of these aspects, you could learn about how things work that weren't known already. It was just, anyway, something was quite powerful about that. So I got my undergrad degrees in physics and PhDs in applied physics. Even within physics, I'd always been interested in optics, light, and microscopy. And so even when I was an undergrad working in the lab of Roger Falcone at UC Berkeley, it became clear that, I enjoyed light, I enjoyed seeing it, I liked the visual aspects, but it was also clear that a lot of the things we wanted to look at could not be seen inside a standard optical microscope. Things like single molecules, right? There's all sorts of fun happening down there. And you're trying to figure out their properties, but you just can't see them, they're too small. And so that was sort of the origin of okay, how can I use light and do microscopy, but to see these objects that so far have been too small to see? So that led to my graduate research and postdoc research. And then at that point, my first, quote, real job after doing a postdoc was at a place that was just starting. It was called the Molecular Foundry, which is one of the National Nanoscience Research Centers, aimed specifically to tackle the challenges of nanoscience, right? When I started there in 2006, when the building was first opening. And I think that really shaped me, working with all other nanoscientists with all different backgrounds, really just, led to amazing science, and it quickly was clear that the approach of nanoscience, which is inherently multidisciplinary, was what was needed for tackling a lot of large-scale challenges.
So you mentioned the tools and the tool development, and I think that one of the things we talk about a lot when we look at the advent and application and growth of nanotechnology has been due to the development of tools and looking at AFM and STM in the 80s, and then better and better tools that enable us to do this. So why did you choose light techniques to probe these materials to image at the nanoscale?
It's a great question. Looking back, optical microscopy and spectroscopy has really been sort of the workhorse for science and continues to be a major workhorse in terms of characterization tools for science. In fact, the stereotypical image one has in their mind of a biologist, right, is someone in a lab coat sitting at a microscope, staring at, a cell or tissue or something. And, and there's good reason for that. It's because we all sort of intuitively understand that by looking at something, we get a good feel for its properties. The way that the material responds to light happens to tell you a lot about its properties, about what it's composed of, right? When we look at something, we can tell that it's metal or plastic or wood, and then we can be more scientific and learn about other aspects as well. But the point is that photons, light, are really good probes of materials. And so that was an aspect that first appealed to me. And so then the challenge became, there then were these limitations about how far can you push optical microscopy? How small an object can you see? And it turns out there's some really fundamental limits to this, right? This is part of nanoscience, is figuring out how to get past these limitations. Most of nanoscience involves structures that are smaller than what you're allowed to see. But by allowed, I mean the rules of physics. This is the so-called diffraction limit, but there's this fundamental property that tells us that if you have a wave, it doesn't matter if it's a light wave or a sound wave, any other kind of wave, you can't focus that wave down to a spot smaller than roughly half its wavelength. And so if you would like to deal with visible and near visible light, like I was sort of just always enjoyed, those have wavelengths of a few hundred nanometers, and that's much larger than the things you want to see. If you want to look at a cell, right, a biological cell, you can see a cell. Cells are 10 microns in size, right? So almost the thickness of a human hair. But for the nanoscale, what's within a cell, the organelles, the DNA, it's all much smaller than you could typically see with an optical microscope. So that's kind of, anyway, that drove me.
So, what strategies did you develop in order to overcome these limitations?
Oh, great question. So the approach we took was to try to develop antennas for light, analogous to the antenna you have on your car. I don't know. Do cars have antennas anymore? Maybe they don't. But at least when I
I
was,
remember when they did.
yeah, I certainly remember when they did. So radio waves tend to have wavelengths of sort of meters to kilometers. And you put an antenna on your car that does a very good job. Antennas are very good at efficiently collecting radiation, electromagnetic waves. And then once you capture that energy, squeezing it down to very small length scales, very small volumes that are much smaller than that wavelength. And so this happens, again, in your car where the antenna captures the energy, but then squeezes it down to the microelectronics that are in your stereo and ultimately, deal with it and turn it into something, a podcast that you can hear, right? So we want to do the same thing for light. It turns out it was a little more challenging for light, and that's because light operates at higher frequencies. Photons have a little bit more energy. But once we realized that you could take advantage of certain properties, in particular of metals at the time, something called a plasmonic resonance, that sort of gave us the tools for taking light and squeezing it. Basically, what we do is we take light, we turn the wave of light into a wave of electrons, and those have much smaller wavelengths, and then we can concentrate the energy to much smaller length scales. So we made antennas for light, and then we use those to do microscopy, but at the nanoscale. So we call it nanoscopy.
So, what type of properties have you been able to image that you weren't able to do before?
The neat thing about this field is that because the tools have been around to some degree kind of since the late 80s, early 90s. It was a field that was a startup called Near Field Scanning Optical Microscopy. It was one of the main tools for doing this. One of the pioneers actually was a gentleman named Eric Betzig, who won the Nobel Prize in 2014 for doing super resolution imaging, but it very expressly said it wasn't for the near field component. He went on and figured out other components actually that we now work on as well. It's a hard technique, especially early on. It was tough, and there's only a few people doing it. But the good thing about that, right, there's a little job security here, is that when you can do it, everything you see is new. The first answer to your question is everything. Everything we see is new. But beyond that, there are a couple specific things that I think have been really revealing to us. One type of material that we've really been interested in studying recently are so-called two-dimensional materials, and in particular, 2D semiconductors. And as you might imagine, if you have a truly flat semiconductor, right, unlike silicon, or we normally think of semiconductors as being these bulk crystals, and then you do nanofabrication to make electronics. The ultimate reduction in size is to make it atomically thin. And so these materials are already atomically thin, so people's imagination started running wild. Can you use these for making really small electronics, which means they use very little power? Right? It kind of felt like this is sort of the next generation. And so people started making devices out of these. And the problem is that the devices typically didn't perform as well as they theoretically should. And the question was why? What you quickly realize is that, when you do normal optical characterization of these materials and you're doing it at this sort of large length scale, you see sort of an ensemble average of properties. You couldn't tell if the material was behaving perfectly or if there was heterogeneity beyond what you could see. And so what we were able to quickly reveal is that the material, while it might look uniform in a regular optical microscope, was far from uniform, was very heterogeneous. And then not only that gave us hints as to what was causing the heterogeneity, what was making the material not be a nice, ideal, perfectly smooth semiconductor, but have lots of bumps and warts and lots of charge traps and things like that made it more inefficient than it should be. And so then people have been able to solve some of these issues because you can now go in and characterize where this heterogeneity lies and what its origin is. Another thing that we've been able to more specifically discover in these materials is we've been able to realize the origins of single photon emitters that also show up in these materials. And this was pretty exciting. I should start off by saying that if you were trying to think of an ideal light source, right, what it would actually be is a source that emitted a photon whenever you wanted, as frequently as you wanted, at whatever energy you wanted, right? So sort of everything on demand and was completely tunable. And it could, and you had control down to the level of single photons. It turns out that there are a number of things that act as single photon sources. Fluorescent molecules can do this. Quantum dots can do this. And a number of other things that act like quantum dots, like defect centers and crystals. The issue with a lot of single photon sources is that they have some of the properties you want, but not all of them. And in particular, they're not typically very tunable. What you see is what you get. The light that comes out is what you have to deal with. And when people discovered that you could have these single photon states in the 2D materials, they got very excited. And it was because, as you might imagine, with the 2D material, it's very thin and floppy, and you can manipulate it and bend it. In fact, I have a colleague here at Columbia named Dmitry Basov, who likes to say the materials are ultra manipulatable. That turns out to be a great property. So there's this promise that actually you could have these single photon sources, but that you would be able to manipulate their properties because of the material they were embedded in. The issue is that this was in 2015, discovered that these sources existed in these 2D materials. Then they didn't know what the origin of these sources were. What are they? And so there were a number of hypotheses out there. People, it was clear that they were related to regions where the material could get strained. But based on previous experience with other materials, I also assumed like defects were involved, things like that. And so what we've done somewhat recently was shown that, in fact, you can get these quantum dot single photon emitter states in these materials by using very localized strain and strain only. You don't need a defect. And this was done by combining our tool for doing optical microscopy with some advanced theory. It was Frank Jonka's group in Bremen, as well as another colleague of mine named Nick Boris that's at Montana State. We kind of teamed up and showed that, in fact, in regions that are highly strained in these materials, you can form these nano wrinkles that really give you the confinement that allow you to create single photon sources. And excitingly, you could see this kind of emission even at room temperature. And so that was exciting because a lot of single photon sources only demonstrate their best properties at very low temperatures. And if you're trying to think about technological applications, not necessarily having to cool down to liquid helium temperatures is advantageous. Not required, but advantageous.
So with respect to the 2D materials, when you get these nano wrinkles, as you call them, is this the same as the nano bubble work that I've seen?
Yeah, that's exactly the picture to have in mind, yeah.
And then depending on the size and shape of that bubble, you can tune the properties of the emission?
That's right. We like the nanobubbles because they are sort of a neat model system in these materials. There's sort of inhomogeneous strain all over the place, plus you can kind of tune a bubble by putting more pressure inside it or poking on it and change the local strain profile pretty easily. And also, bubbles tend to naturally form in these materials. When you take a 2D material and you just put it on top of another material, usually some fluid or gas gets trapped in there. And so they form nicely. If you're trying to make a device, controlling where the bubbles form themselves would be a challenge. But you can absolutely envision ways, and there are other groups that have made some amazing progress on figuring out ways that you can very locally and sort of spatially deterministically create strain sort of where you want it. But first, right, what you needed to know is, would that be helpful? Does strain play a role, and how does it influence these emitters? And so what we learned is in these bubbles, actually, you have the bubbles, but even within a bubble, you actually had these nanoscale wrinkles that would pop up. This was predicted by theory that these 2D materials, if you did some sort of atomistic sort of first principles types theoretical investigation, that once you reached a certain amount of strain, the wrinkling and buckling should occur. And it's those tiny, tight wrinkles and buckles that we think are the key.
Very exciting. So what types of 2D materials have you been investigating? I mean, graphene there's a host of 2D materials.
We have mostly been concentrating on the 2D semiconductors. A lot of our colleagues study graphene. There's still a lot of fun physics to learn there. But we've been concentrating primarily on the semiconductors, partly because they have some optical properties that have always been appealing to someone who does optical microscopy. But we have looked at other types of 2D materials. There's these wide bandgap insulators called hexagonal boron nitride, but primarily it's these semiconductors. And they're kind of fun too because people have been using them for decades. They're like graphene, right, which is just a single layer of graphite. They were basically used as lubricants because they form in like bulk crystals, but really they're layered crystals, and the layers can move very easily relative to one another. And that actually makes it easy then to peel a single layer off and to study it and then ultimately to use it.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that you brought up earlier, which is interdisciplinarity. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity with respect to how nanotechnology brings disciplines together. Can you share your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, nanoscience is, as I mentioned before, is inherently multidisciplinary. Most disciplines at some point have a part of them that is operating at the sort of nanometer length scale, right? Typically defined to be sort of 1 to 100 nanometers. And what we're trying to take advantage of is the fact that when you take a material and you start reducing its size down to this sort of 10-ish nanometer length scale, all of a sudden the material's properties change, and they're very much a function of the material's size and shape at that length scale. And so this is really appealing because this gives you a nice knob to tune properties and to create new properties that don't exist by being able to manipulate matter at that length scale. So, biology figured this out a long time ago, right? There's a reason our proteins are that size in our bodies. Chemists have been They kind of come at nanotechnology from the other side. They've been making tiny things forever, right? Molecules and things like that. Meanwhile, you've got the electrical engineers who first were making microchips, and they were big, but now they've making transistors that are sub 10 nanometers in size and things like that. But I think the appeal of nanoscience is that it can be used to attack larger scale problems and challenges that exist in the world. And most of these challenges exist at the intersection of disciplines. You need multiple people's expertise in order to truly address these problems, right? And these problems are not small, neat, tidy packages for the most part. This is one reason I really, kind of bought into and went to work at this place called the Molecular Foundry, which was, as I mentioned, a National Nanoscience Research Center, but it was started by the Department of Energy as part of the NNI. I mean, the idea was really very simple. They know that nanoscience is interdisciplinary, so they built a building, and they hired as many people that sort of worked nominally at the nano-length scale, but from all different backgrounds, put them into one building and hoped they'd talk to one another. And it turned out to work a lot better than even they, I think, had anticipated. One reason that it was particularly beneficial is that all of us scientists, we're all motivated to tackle these bigger problems and to work with one another. I do think that collaboration tends to be how science moves forward the fastest. Then we quickly realized there's a big barrier, which is that all of us scientists from different disciplines talk different languages. And this is a huge issue. This is probably the biggest issue to multidisciplinary science. I started talking to my chemist friends, my biologist friends. At first, we're just talking over each other's heads. But if you sit it out and you learn to communicate better and what questions to ask and how to understand what they're saying, and once we figured that out, we had some amazing lunchtime seminars where basically that was the goal. People would throw up slides about what they were working on. You'd never get past the first slide because you just were explaining all of the jargon that was in your title. But that turned out, like I said, to be incredibly beneficial. Once you were able to kind of establish that you guys understood each other, and you could really ask the deeper questions about what are the challenges, how can we fix it, here's what we can bring to the table. And that's what's really exciting to me. And I think that's also what's continuing to be needed for taking on these big challenges.
So what advice do you give your students who are interested in studying nanoscience?
It is definitely worth spending the time to try to understand what your colleagues in different fields are doing, right? Take the time to talk to the chemists, understand what they're doing. It's easy to try to, ask a quick question or get a piece of material and that's it, and not understand sort of where it's coming from. So it's absolutely worth learning their language. And the other piece of advice is don't be afraid to fail. Particularly when you're doing interdisciplinary science, your idea never works the first time, the research, the experiment never works the first time. And part of that, what is sort of a subset of advice that everyone knows, but is important, is don't be afraid to ask what you think is the dumb question. That's maybe the hardest part about trying to talk to people outside your field, is you need to ask those questions to grow.
I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. This was a lot of fun. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
A key component of doing good science is being able to communicate your results. So when I say don't be afraid to fail, it applies to the research, but it applies as much to all the other parts of science that aren't specifically the experiment, which includes being able to communicate what you've done. Because otherwise, it's not going to have an impact if no one knows about the work.